the moment that there's some kind of urgency in yourself because of this concept, subconscious concept, they shouldn't be suffering, or it's not okay for them to suffer. When you have a thought like that, when you have a model of the world like that, and you're perceiving suffering in front of you, it makes a lot of sense that your body's like, do something. Do something now, quick, do something, fix this.
Hello, my beautiful friends. My name is Dr. Becc.
And I am Kristeen Barker, and this is Am I Doing It Wrong? A podcast for doctors by doctors. Dr. Becc is a mindset coach and medical doctor who specialises in liberating driven professional women from the limitations of perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and people pleasing. She's basically the cheat code for getting out of your own way, showing up authentically, and living a life you're proud of.
And Kristeen is a medical educator and nephrologist who creates resources for doctors in training that I truly think are an unfair advantage. She makes complex topics super simple and takes the pain and uncertainty out of passing your medical exams. Kristeen and I connected a few years ago via our online platforms, and over the years we've discussed countless highs, lows, and in-betweens of doctor life. And in doing so, we've experienced firsthand the power of vulnerable conversations to show us where we're getting in our own way and underestimating our capacity.
So we want you to be part of the conversation and experience these same results. Every week on the pod, we'll be bringing you conversations which shine light in dark places, normalise the doctor journey, ease unnecessary suffering, and give you actionable steps to thrive in all facets of your life. So grab a cuppa and get cozy for this week's episode of Am I Doing It Wrong? The podcast for doctors by doctors.
Welcome to another episode of Am I Doing It Wrong? The podcast for doctors by doctors. It's so fun to see you guys coming back again and again and again. Please let us know if there's anything that comes up that you would really like for us to talk about, that you would like to explore a bit with us. And as always, please comment and let us know what you think about the actual episodes. Add in your perspectives, add in your thoughts, argue with us. If you like, we are just open to, we're just two doctors' experiences, but what we really want to do is bring all the doctors together. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode, which is all about how we as professionals, professional clinicians, hold space for difficult emotions with our patients. So if you are an empathetic doctor, which is the case for, gosh, I would dare to say almost, it's going to be close to 100% of my clients, I reckon, would resonate with the concept of being an empathetic person. And, you know, I suppose because of the challenges that being an empathetic person can bring when you're working in the medical profession, surrounded by so much suffering and truly tragedy in so many cases as well. So when you are an empathetic doctor, when you're a supremely caring person who wants the best for everybody in the world, this can be a very difficult character trait. But what we want to talk about today is how it can also be an absolute superpower. And we want to help you guys harness your empathy to create the best situation, help you show up for your patients how you want to, and also importantly, treat yourself the way that you deserve to be treated as that empathetic clinician, because there's usually not just one person suffering in this scenario. When you're an empathetic doctor, there's two of you here. So we're going to take care of you yourself in this as well, while helping you show up for your patients. All right, Kristeen, you've got a gorgeous example for us. You're going to take us away from medicine for a little while and back into a flashy, gorgeous, beautiful wedding.
Thanks, Becc. I am so excited for today's episode. Empathy is something that is so close to my being. Sometimes I'm really proud of it. Sometimes I'm really scared of it. And so today is a real coming home episode for me in terms of processing the last, I think, decade while I've tried to harness this and this 4-step process that we're going to share with you guys to turn empathy into your superpower is pure magic. So stay tuned. But as I was talking to Becc about this episode, I was thinking back to a really beautiful moment I had recently where I really realized that sometimes empathy is not helpful in every situation, or it can show up in that way where it's actually not helpful. And it happened at a wedding. And I don't know about you, but I could go to somebody's wedding I don't even know, and I will cry, right? I'll just cry. I'll cry when someone does the speech. I'll cry at the altar part. It's like, it's pure empathy. Or it's like, even if I go to the airport, have you ever been at the airport and you see someone being reunited with someone? I cry every time, right? It's just pure empathy. So weddings are an empathetic experience, and in a beautiful way. But my partner in this actual wedding, he was a good friend of the couple, and they'd asked him to be the celebrant. And so he was actually up the front in no official capacity. They'd already been married a few days before, but he was doing the ceremony and he was being the celebrant. So he's up there at the front, and I am in the crowd, and I turn round as the bride is going to walk down the aisle. And of course, as soon as you see the bride, I started to well up in an empathetic way, started to get emotional, started to get a bit teary in a happy way. And as she walked down the aisle, I could see that she herself was crying, and she was actually shaking. And so that made my tears even worse. And I mean, it was an absolute disaster. I had on these, like, I don't do eyelashes, but that is what made me think I was going to do eyelashes on this day. I did. So I was crying, and then my eyelashes started to fall off. It was a whole scene. Anyway, I digress. So I'm doing the crying thing, and it was really, really beautiful. But as she got up to the altar, and she was in this kind of emotional state, I saw this beautiful thing happen with my partner, where it was almost like it was invisible, but he just completely held the space for her. It was like this energy that wasn't empathy. It was something else, this beautiful masculine energy, I guess I would call it. It was like, I got you, everything's okay, you're safe, this is beautiful. Like it said so many things without saying anything at all. And I had a really profound experience where I realized, like, it was so good that I wasn't the celebrant, because I would have been like, how am I going to speak? How am I going to do this, right? I'm not going to function enough to help this couple get married, right? So I would have been completely useless. And here was this other energy that I can't even fully describe. I'll call it masculine energy for now. It was so beautiful. And it was just a lovely, lovely moment. So I guess all of that to say that it's a good example of where empathy can show up, but not be helpful, or at least the crying definitely wasn't helpful to that person. Maybe having the emotion was okay, but the actual expression of that emotion in that moment in real time wouldn't have been okay if I was the celebrant. And so I think it's just a light-hearted story, but one that we can all relate to in terms of our clinical practice, where we are always encountering so many emotions. It's an absolute roller coaster. Sometimes it is joy, but a lot of the times it's the harder stuff, and you can feel it bubble up inside you. And I guess it begs the question, when you do get that feeling inside you, what is your response? What are you doing right now? Do you think that is the most helpful thing, or is there another way? So we're going to unpack that today. I'm super keen to get your perspective on this, Becc.
I love that story with the parallel examples of both of you have acknowledged what the bride was experiencing. You both did that empathetic step. And let's even stop there and define empathy in that really simple way, which I would say empathy is just an understanding of somebody else's experience, an understanding, a recognition of their experience. Even you could go so far to say that it is experiencing their experience. So in the literature, I've read of empathy defined as two sort of subsets. You can have cognitive empathy and or emotional empathy. So when you think about cognitive empathy, you're intellectually recognizing what they're going through, or you're looking at that person, you're thinking about that person, and you're thinking, what must it be like for them? What's happening in their world? And then the reason why I said experiencing what they're experiencing is because that's probably the only way you can, or that's what's happening when we're feeling the sadness. Like we're looking at the bride and we feel that sadness. That can be, and I'm sorry, sadness wasn't necessarily the reason for your tears. You said they were happy tears.
Happy tears.
But yeah, that emotion that you were feeling that brought up the tears, that sounds like you were emotionally empathizing. And the only way that you can emotionally empathize is to also feel the emotion. I suppose technically you could think about, you could intellectualize the fact that they're, or your assumption that they're feeling this emotion, or this must feel like this to them. But what we most commonly do when we think about feelings is we feel the feelings too, don't we? And it's quite difficult to sort of piece those two apart. And I guess the question is here, and something that we will play with a bit today is, do we want to piece them apart? Do we want to turn off that emotional experience that we have when we empathize? Because, you know, I think the intellectual can only take us so far. Humans are so intrinsically emotional. We can't make decisions without our emotions. We like to think that we're these rational economic beings, don't we? Especially doctors, we like to think it's all logic up here. It's logic ruling the show. But we know that when you shut down, or you remove, or you don't have functioning emotional centers in your brain, the key emotional centers, we can't even make decisions. It doesn't matter how elaborate the pro and con intellectual lists are. We can't make decisions without our emotions, or we become less efficient and less good at making decisions for ourselves. So I think in this episode, we'd really like to push back a little bit against what's been, you know, some pretty strong dogma over the last decades, certainly in medicine, that emotions aren't useful. And I guess exactly as you're saying, Kristeen, you had these two experiences where you both had empathy for the bride, but they showed up in your behavior in a very different way. And I think about how, you know, your partner, it sounds like he showed up in exactly the way that was helpful to the bride in that moment. And he couldn't have done that without empathy. You know, if he wasn't able to look at her and make reasonably accurate guesses about what she's experiencing, he couldn't also get himself to the next step of, what can I do to be in service of her right now? What can I do to get her to where she wants to be right now, to create that space for her right now? And that's what we want to bring to you guys as doctors, because we know that it is ultimately what we're all coming into our jobs to do. We want to be in service for the patient. And there's this confusion that being in service for our patient means A, not being emotional, but B, with that, making their suffering go away, or making whatever emotional experience they're having go away. And in this episode today, we're talking about empathy. We're going to pull it back to empathy first, and then using empathy as that superpower. Only then are we going to step forwards and answer the question of, so what will I do with this knowledge? With this empathy that I have created through this connection, this very human connection, this care that comes with empathy for another person's experience. Now, what am I going to do with it? And I think another way that we can see empathy come up, and you mentioned one way, Kristeen, which was emotions that don't serve the person you're empathizing with. Some emotions, and it's always contextual. It's not that any emotion is bad, but as you were saying, in that moment, that wasn't, like, if you were up there on the altar, that wouldn't have been what would have been most helpful for her. Potentially, that's your guess. But for doctors, a lot of what I find, this comes up with my clients a lot, is this, as doctors, we have identified as these people that help patients, we relieve suffering, we make people's lives better. That's our job. That's what I train to do, to make people's lives better. And we fall into this trap of being a fixer. And being a fixer comes up with empathetic people, in the sense of, you feel that empathy, you get that empathetic awareness. Oh, this person's suffering. And the inclination for a fixer is to fix the suffering, i.e. to make the suffering go away. And we often see that if we don't have awareness, sometimes we don't have awareness that fixing isn't useful, but we've all probably had an experience where that empathy is kind of being misused a bit, where you've taken some kind of suffering to somebody and they've tried to fix it. I just want you to think about that experience in your life. Have you taken suffering to somebody and then had them, instead of hold space for that suffering or see you in that suffering, be patient with you in that suffering, be kind and compassionate in the suffering, or just purely empathize with you. Just take time to empathize with you. Have you had that experience where people are like, well, why don't you just do this? Oh, why don't you think about it this way? Oh, let's just go and get an ice cream and distract you. And so I think that's a really common way that I see a misunderstanding, or let's call it a misuse of empathy, come up for doctors.
What I was also thinking about when you were talking about the cognitive versus the emotive, is that what you called it? I feel like my experience of empathy is that, yes, I can cognitively try and tune into someone, but that thing that happened at the wedding is like the feeling comes before any thought, or there's no thought. And I think in that sense, to me, it feels very primitive, very, very basic in terms of our human abilities. I mean, it is a superpower like we're going to see today, but in terms of like your human capabilities, it just happens. You don't have to think about it. Yeah, you don't have to practice it even. It just happens. And then I think when it just happens, there can be some automatic things, modes that you go into, because you're not really thinking. You are just feeling and you're just reacting. And I think something that comes up for me in that fixer mode is also just the intolerance of human suffering. And I mean, I say that the first, I guess, notion is, oh, I can't tolerate human suffering. But I guess when I really think about it, I can't tolerate how it makes me feel either. So I don't want them to feel like that, but I also don't want to feel like that. So I am highly motivated to fix this because I don't want to feel bad, because I can feel, or some degree of what they might be feeling, and it's uncomfortable. And so I think this, I guess I just want to say that because if you are a fixer right now, it's probably just because you're reacting to this uncomfortable feeling, and it's completely normal, and it's okay. It's absolutely okay. And it's so common. We were talking about just before we came on how if you've had a sadness in your life, like if you've lost someone or you're grieving, or even if you've had a breakup, we can all relate to that feeling as well, of not only people sort of patting us on the head and taking us for an ice cream, but also it feels time limited. Like we're only allowed to be sad for so long. We're only allowed to be stuck in that rut for so long before we feel like we've exhausted people around us. And I think that is the product of what I'm talking about, that discomfort. Like people don't like you being uncomfortable, makes them uncomfortable. And so I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. So the fixer thing is I guess the manifestation of that. Like we don't like other people to be suffering around us, and there is an intolerance of suffering in general.
Yeah, we see suffering and we think they shouldn't be suffering. People should be happy all the time. People should not feel negative emotions. People can't handle negative emotions. They can't handle that. They're this precious, gorgeous human. They can't tolerate it. And it's, these are the kind of perceptions, thoughts that we have about suffering in our society these days. There's this insidious idea that I think, intellectually we don't agree with it. Intellectually, you can see it's ludicrous, the idea to be happy all the time. But when you see people's reactions to sadness, and when we see our own reactions to sadness or suffering, then these beliefs are revealed. These beliefs are revealed, aren't they? Because why can't we sit with somebody? And usually this is seconds, right? Usually we don't allow ourselves to sit with people suffering for even a few seconds. But intellectually, wouldn't we all agree that when you lose somebody, for example, that you have hours and hours and hours of appreciating that loss ahead of you? Hours and hours and hours of all of those, quote, negative emotions that come up. And wouldn't we all agree that that's expected? So it's a really interesting phenomenon. And I feel the same way too. And I noticed this in myself too. I noticed that when I perceive suffering, those automatic thoughts still come up. And I only know that because the emotions come up, the impatience comes up, and the sense of do something comes up. So we're really encouraging you guys to look at that as well, because the moment that there's some kind of urgency in yourself because of this concept, subconscious concept, they shouldn't be suffering, or it's not okay for them to suffer. When you have a thought like that, when you have a model of the world like that, and you're perceiving suffering in front of you, it makes a lot of sense that your body's like, do something now, quick, do something, fix this, doesn't it? But notice how that's us acting from that, our own sense of urgency, our own wanting to make that suffering go away. And we're no longer focused on the person in front of us and what they're actually going through. Now we're just acting from this model of the world ourselves and the impatience, the urgency that it's creating in us. So it's a very humbling experience, actually, because, as a caring person, as a person who's always resonated with wanting to reduce suffering for the sake of people having the best lives possible, just caring about other people, it can be really humbling to recognize that sometimes this drive to fix things can be more about ourselves and less about what's really helpful for the patient in front of us. And we could say that's true for everything we do as humans, but we just want to offer this to you because sometimes it's the recognition that what we're doing, even though our intentions are good, we're intending to help, we're intending to make this person's experience better, to recognize that sometimes we're not actually acting in a purely altruistic way. Not because you're a bad person, not because you don't have good intentions, but we just want to always be questioning in ourselves what's driving us as humans, because we all have those drives. Every single human, good and bad, everybody has a drive to feel better in the moment. And if your belief system is saying people are not allowed to suffer, I've got to relieve all the suffering in the world, then you're not going to be able to, that's going to be the most urgent thing in the moment, you acting on that urgency.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think what's also true, because you mentioned about when we are acting from that urgency and that impatience and acknowledging that some of that is to soothe ourselves as well as the other person. I think what came up was when you said when we're doing that, we're not truly focused on the other person and what they need. And I think the other part of that can happen or has happened to me in clinical scenarios is that when I myself am upset, and I mean, I'm talking about a patient that I've known for years and now they're dying, or I've just had to tell them they're dying, and really it's probably more the empathy for the family members in the room losing their loved one and the people that are left behind. That gets me a lot. And I guess I've had those scenarios where I actually am on the brink of tears and I'm thinking to myself, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. And I'm trying to focus on not having tears to the point where I can't speak, or not having tears roll down my face visibly. And I'm sure the family members to some point appreciate a little bit of a tear in my eye, but I still need to be functional. And so it wouldn't be my intention to be completely unemotional in that situation, but there'll be a part of me that's trying to be there for them and trying to do what they need me to do. And in the meantime, I'm having this experience where I'm shoving down whatever's bubbling up, and then my attention's just purely focused on that. I'm split, then I'm divided between what I'm supposed to be doing in this space and holding this space, and then also just Kristeen, just, you know what I mean, simmer down, love. So I think that's also another part of it, is not showing up in the way that you want to for them, is that being so conscious of what you look like and whether you're going to cry, whether you're going to bust into tears. Can I control myself emotionally? And you said right at the start of this, that is not the done thing. A crying doctor, it's not the done thing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this scenario right now, just playing devil's advocate a bit with you here. Because there's crying that's sort of this all-consuming crying. I think you think about, you take yourself in a different room and you can cry for a few minutes, and you kind of let all those painful thoughts come out and the tears keep rolling and rolling and rolling. And then I'm thinking about this other situation where you're meeting the patient and their family, you're looking into their eyes, and as you're speaking or as you're listening to them, that bubbling sadness comes up, and a tear or two rolls down your face, or maybe you choke up as you say a couple of words. And in my experience of sadness, just pure sadness without any of the extra judgments and frustrations and I shouldn'ts and resistance on top, I'm still thinking very clearly. In fact, I'm highly focused when I'm in that kind of sad state. Very different to me to being in that sort of really highly aroused state where I'm sort of the tears are pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring, and I'm catching my breath because, you know, you're very, there's a lot of energy in the sadness. And I'm just wondering for you is, I don't know if you have ever cried with a patient. Have you ever had that experience? Because I've had that experience where, you know, my eyes have gone glassy and maybe a tear's dropped, like that kind of thing with the patient. And I have zero issue with showing that kind of emotion with a patient. And I don't believe it impairs that emotion. It's probably, you know, we're not very good at emotions. It's probably a different emotion on the emotional spectrum, that kind of sadness is sort of like slow versus that highly aroused, activated sadness. Yeah, I'm just thinking I'm quite in favor actually of that former example of sadness. Whereas I can see how that latter sadness isn't something that I would ever want to, it's not something that I ever choose to bring into a consult. So it's just interesting. I'd call them both sad and I'm crying in both situations, but they look very different and it affects me cognitively very differently.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I think when I'm in a private space and I'm actually allowing myself to express my emotions, I think it is different from, and I think there's the more experienced I've become and the more situations I've been in, I think I'm not entirely sure what you would call it. I think it happens to me a lot less, and not because I don't feel the emotions. I think I've expanded my emotional regulation, but equally as a consultant, just to be fair to everybody who's listening, you're not chronically sleep deprived. I think as a registrar, my threshold for tears just for not having lunch that day were quite, you know, the threshold was low. So then I think, you know, like just add in this stuff and then you've got this, the threshold might have changed just by the demands of your workload and whether you'd had enough, you know, nutrition and sleep and basics. So I think also that's changed. But yeah, you're right. I forgive myself in the moments where I am showing a little bit of emotion, because usually that's happening with someone I've had a deep bond with, like there's something deeper there about the patient-doctor relationship, and it'll be like their whole family will be involved and that we've been on a journey together and that kind of thing. Yeah, and I guess I've also purposely chosen renal because I seem to be able to handle the sadness in renal, because there's dialysis and there's transplants. So even when your organ fails, we've got some options. And I deliberately avoided other specialties where I felt like I wasn't previously able to handle them, like oncology and hematology and stuff like that. So I've made choices based on my emotional, I don't want to call it a bad thing. I don't know, but whatever happens to me in clinical practice, there's only so much I can handle and I know my limits and that's it. And so, yeah, I think you're right. And I do think clearly, but I think there's also like a mental narrative where although I can think clearly and I can still articulate myself most of the time, there's a worry that I'm just on the verge of not being functional. And so it does distract me from the pureness of the moment. Like, you know, I am showing up for them, and I think probably from their perspective I'm probably showing up in a beautiful way, but equally there's just this part of me that understands that there's rules that I can't break, like you're allowed this much tears but not this much tears, and you know what I mean, like, and I'm conscious of where that line is. Also, I don't want to, like, because I feel like they're the people who deserve to have the space. Like, I'm not really supposed to be holding the space for myself. So I'm judging myself for like how much space I need in that moment. I'm like, Kristeen, this is not about you. This is you know, I'm adding in judgment, which is what you always say is half the problem all the time that I have, but adding in judgment to whatever it is, when, like you say, there's probably nothing wrong with a tiny little bit of emotion. So we've kind of gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity of this and how it can be shown up for you.
I would really like to pose that question to everybody because, again, I think there has been a dogma over the years, and we all sort of act like it's a fact that our emotions are a bad thing in medicine. And again, that emotions somehow make us less logical, less rational. Like I said earlier, emotions are a critical component of decision making. And let's even just contrast this with how much you're allowed to be cheerful with a patient who has just had a great outcome. You know, we don't put limitations on that, do we? You're allowed to be so happy for the patient who's just had a good outcome, but we're not allowed to be sad. And so it makes me question, you know, whether it's really about the emotions or whether it's more about our discomfort with negative emotions and what we make it mean. Even this idea that you can't think straight when you're feeling emotions, which has some truth to it, of course. But what I would really like people to do is not take a cookie cutter approach to emotions, which is something that we do not understand well. Not the current literature at the moment, we do not have solid conclusions to draw about how useful or not useful emotions are categorically. Doesn't exist. We don't know the cognitive effects of certain emotional states on our brain and our ability to rationally think. So we've just carried this idea with us from medical school, from respectful authorities. But what we really, you know, the best thing you could do for yourself in a state of limited conclusions and literature is to build that self-awareness. And, you know, I just acknowledged before that even for me, I could say I'm having the emotion of sadness, and even sadness that makes me feel like teary or crying. But even within that, there are two very different versions of me crying there. One makes me hyper focused on the patient. One is a result of me empathizing with the patient and then being willing to sit with them and say, this must be hard for you, or is this hard for you? And hearing them say back to me, this is very hard for me. And just sitting with that to the point that I allow myself to feel the emotion, not to indulge myself, but to think, what are they going through? That's a respectful connection that I'm making with the patient. However, without that self-awareness and that emotional regulation, and with the sort of dynamic nature of emotions and our you know, racing thoughts, the way that our mind jumps to conclusions and goes on tangents, we can go down a slippery slope of suddenly going into an emotional state that has deviated away from what serves the patient. And what I would really like to see is not for us to categorically say emotions aren't allowed or negative emotions aren't allowed, but much like the direction that Kristeen was going, and you have from the start, you've been asking the question, what is the effect of this emotion? Is this emotion that I'm experiencing, i.e. this state that I'm showing up in terms of which it's a combination. Your emotions are a reflection of your cognitive state, your nervous system state, and then they're sort of cycling and influencing each other too. And we're asking, is this emotion here serving the patient right now? Is this emotion here aligned with the way that I want to show up with this patient or not? And I think that is our next step to try and address or use our emotions to our advantage as clinicians. And I'd really like to see that narrative or this approach to emotions as the next stepping stone away from categorically saying that emotions are a bad thing, because firstly, I think it's very hypocritical of us. We're allowing some emotions but not other emotions. And secondly, it's simply not backed by conclusive research or evidence. It's something that's been passed from one person to the other, but we're not sure yet. And with that, we can also see there is a lot of research emerging suggesting how useful emotions are. And I'd just like to sort of round this out with saying, for me personally, some of my best moments in my lifetime have been when somebody sees me, whether it's in a positive experience or a negative experience, whether they're whether they're meeting me in suffering or whether they're meeting me in my proudest, greatest moment or joy. But to have another human being say without words, I see you, I'm here in this moment with you, they're genuinely some of my best moments. And I've had that reflected back from patients too, that they expect, they not expect this, they want this from their doctors. They don't want their doctors to be robotic or always positive or always fixing and quickly moving them on to the next step.
Absolutely. And I do feel like they appreciate that humanity. They absolutely do. And actually, I've probably said this before, but I have definitely had patients, families, even like friends who've said to me, like, how can you do those conversations? Like, they don't understand. They might have received the news, but they're like, how did that doctor do that? Like, we don't realize that they have empathy for us. It's so interesting. But I love what you said there about having two pathways. Like, when you feel that emotion come up and having that self-awareness. And then you said there were two pathways. There was the pathway that serves the patient and the pathway which serves the patient less, serves us more. Maybe we'll say that. And I guess at the moment, like I said before, I feel like when these emotions come up, it's so primitive, it's so basic. I don't often get a chance to think because I'm too busy going, oh, oh, I must fix it. Like you said, I must fix it, I must do something. And I just want everyone to think about what happens when this happens to you in your clinical practice or in other situations. When you get that emotion come up, you've probably got maybe more than one technique depending on the scenario, but you've probably got a practiced pathway that you just automatically go down without thinking about it. And it may not be serving you and it may not be serving them. But I think if, you know, after listening to this episode today, having that awareness of the next time you feel that feeling, that empathy arise within you, you'll be able to then make a choice, right? You can then say, do I want to go down this pathway? Do I want to go down this other pathway? And when you feel that feeling, you can understand why you're feeling that feeling. And then the next question could be, you know, how do I show up in this moment that's going to be the best way to show up in this moment? And that sort of is something that I've been practicing over the past few years. And it's definitely, I found it really, really, really helpful to sort of almost translate the feeling into, not necessarily into action, but just being able to sort of hold the space better. Like, how am I going to hold space for this person? What do they need? Putting the emphasis on them, and then just being a vessel and not feeling attached to soothing them. Like, you might be soothing them, but I think what you said before, Becc, was so palpable to me when you said that we've almost been told that a doctor's job is to ease suffering, it's to soothe people, it's to make people feel better. And I believe that to my core, to the point where I'm wandering around the world just thinking it's my job to ease human suffering, when really life is messy. Like, sometimes things happen in life that you just suffer through, like grief and loss and all the things. And you have to just walk through them. Like, no one can magically make them go away. So I think, like you said before, to think that you're gonna fix this is almost, you know, not achievable in the moment. But I think it's beautiful to have that choice. And so I guess part of this was really just to help us all have a think about where our empathy shows up. It absolutely is a superpower because it does change your behavior. Like, having it there, having it be your little smoke signal, like Becc always says, your little smoke signal, like if it comes up and then you get to say, oh, why is that there? And let's see how I can turn this into my superpower. So I guess that this was a sort of process, but I think also rounding that off is that's kind of when you're with the person and how you're behaving there. But as someone who does have an empathetic tendency, and I'm sure you've talked about this as well, Becc, you're a very empathic person as well. But even if you're not, I feel like if you've been this deep in a human experience, everyone would have a feeling of needing to process, like something just happened, something so profound happened. And we'll probably take it home with us. We may or may not know how to deal with it. It can linger. Sometimes we don't even really know that we'll feel bad or exhausted. We won't necessarily attribute it to that thing, or maybe we've taken that thing home and we're ruminating on it. We can't get it out of our heads. We can't let it go. We're sort of still upset about it. And so I think there's also a process in here where you do what you need to do in the moment to provide what the patient needs. But then there'll be another process separate to that I think is super healthy, to really acknowledge what just happened and really be able to look after yourself. And I'm super interested, Becc, in that looking after ourselves. What would you say would be the best way to do this? Or what do you do in terms of processing and unpacking and sort of clearing out your energy so you can start again and be therapeutic the next day?
When we talk about wanting to ease and soothe suffering, firstly, completely resonates. I want you guys to question if that is different for you than dismissing suffering. You know, if you're saying, let's make this emotional experience go away, are you soothing the suffering, or is this you dismissing the suffering? You know, coming from that place of you shouldn't be feeling suffering. And I ask that because it leads into the answer to your question, Kristeen. What can we do for ourselves? Because I think the process is the same. I think the process of witnessing another human suffering is, for a lot of us, going to create an experience of suffering in ourselves. Humans are a highly empathetic, we have a very empathetic experience and relationship with other people. I think that is just the way that we are. And once again, it's okay if that's not you. It's okay if you don't easily recognize an experience or think about an experience in another person's cognitive and emotional world, whatever's going on in other people's lives. But for a lot of us, it is the case. And I suspect it will be, you know, even more common for people who go into a service industry like healthcare, particularly an industry where we are caring for people, and our goal is to minimize suffering where possible. And, you know, we've learned that soothing and fixing is a good thing, and it certainly is a really useful thing. But my strategy for taking care of you, the other person who's, you know, had this suffering prompted or some kind of sadness prompted by whatever's happening, and it's time for you to, you know, you've taken care of the patient, you showed up in service with them, and now you still have had this experience that hasn't yet been attended to. And again, you know, it's easy enough for us to distract ourselves, which in a way is fixing the problem, isn't it? At least temporarily, it's fixing the problem. But we want to treat ourselves in the same way as, you know, we treat another human that we care about. We want to treat ourselves, therefore, in the same way that we're going to treat this patient. We show up, the way we decide to show up for the patient is the way that we believe, with our best collaborative understanding, is going to help them and is what they want at the time. And we want to do that for ourselves too. So just as we were saying, you know, this patient who is suffering, they deserve to be seen in that, not rushed out of it, not to have it fixed and therefore, you know, unintentionally denied, to say, stop feeling this suffering. You shouldn't be feeling this suffering. Let's make this better. Let's dress this up differently. But we want to do that for ourselves too. And too often I see we don't allow ourselves to feel sad or some kind of negative emotion about anything that's happened in our experience, because we judge ourselves and we say, we shouldn't be sad about that. It's not that bad. Other people have it worse. And so on and so on and so on. And again, the question is always, for you, with your self-awareness, tapping into yourself, is that really useful for you? If it is, if that does, quote, fix the negative experience that you've had, if you do feel like you come away better, not just in the next moment, but in the next day, days, if it doesn't feel like that emotion builds up, that's fine. But for me, what I found is I've made a lot more room in my life over the last couple of years to feel negative without judging myself or not having a good enough reason, or saying, this is about the patient, don't make it about you. Any kind of judgment that comes up, allowing myself to have that negative experience for a myriad of reasons. One, because I respect myself as a fellow human. I respect all the other humans, and I don't get excluded from that. You know, if I'm going to be somebody who respects other people, I better be including myself in that, or what a hypocrite am I? But the other reason is, for the more pragmatic, the other reason is for the more pragmatic of us, those of you guys who just want to cut to the chase and cut out the tears and so on. The benefit of doing this, the benefit of seeing yourself and allowing those negative emotions or challenging emotions in your own space, away from that professional area, is that it ironically gives you more control over them. When you let all the nervous system activation actually complete its course, when you let the energy flow through your body, when you let your mind be heard instead of shushing that sadness and saying, shush, shush, not now, go away, don't worry about that, that's silly, it can just leave that experience unattended to, and that can build up. I'm sure you guys have had that experience where you push it down, you think, I'm good, and then boom, it comes down on you like a tidal wave. But when you can take the time to allow those emotional experiences as more of a routine, you know, I've had a challenging experience, I'm expecting a challenging emotion to come with that. I'm not going to judge myself as to whether it's right or wrong. It's just an emotion. I'm going to respect that and allow myself to have some space. Then you don't get that build up. And also you don't get that panic when you're in front of a patient, because you're used to feeling negative emotions. You know that you have control when you have these challenging emotions. You don't believe that you're suddenly going to spiral into some uncontrollable state, because you've done this so many times before. You've had this emotion in your body and you've maintained your composure. You've maintained your direction. You're not adding in this extra layer of, oh no, an emotion, I'm going to just fall apart and lose myself. So there's this learning process, there's this energy release that happens. And I think that's very important. I think dismissing ourselves is the most counterproductive thing we can do if we want to be better at emotionally regulating. Dismissing ourselves just lets things build and it destroys our self-trust. When our mind says something is wrong here or something bad has happened and we say shush, we're destroying that relationship of trust with ourselves. And then also there's the energy, and then there's also the again, it's sort of that self-trust element of, I have control here, I have my own back here, I'm no longer afraid of negative emotions, which is what we've all been taught. We've all been taught we'll lose control. When you're having a negative emotion, you can't think straight, and so on and so on. But it's not that simple. And when you practice the emotion by yourself, you remove that layer of fear that comes with the emotion as well. So I don't think there are any shortcuts out of this. I think if you want to take care of yourself, the only way to do it is to start to allow those emotions to be with you. The best bit about this is when you don't need to rush yourself out of negative emotion, you will be able to do the same thing for the patient. You recognize, I've had negative emotions before and I'm okay. And what I wanted in that moment was to be seen. I wanted somebody to be patient with me. I did not want somebody to tell me that, you know, let's fix this, let's hurry and get to the productive part. You know, sometimes you do, but it's also okay sometimes to just have that emotional experience. When you can do that for yourself, then you can authentically do that for your patient. If that's the person they want you to be at the moment, then you have the option to just be there and hold that space for them. So crying is actually something that I find highly productive and pragmatic in my life. And I had such a better experience of being sad now that I can be sad without judging myself. I can just be sad. And the funny thing is that when you remove all the layers of urgency and frustration and judgment off, the sadness runs its course. It lasts a lot longer. It lasts a much shorter amount of time when you're not simultaneously resisting it and stacking all those other judgment-related emotions on top.
Sadness without judgment is actually a really beautiful human experience, isn't it? Like if you actually just think about what you just said, it's pretty profound actually. As long as those other layers aren't there, the sadness itself is the product of something good. the strength of love. It's a really beautiful, beautiful thing. And I also love what you said there about releasing, and whatever that means for you in terms of just understanding that you need to look after yourself the way you would look after someone else, and not shove it down and dismiss and disregard yourself. And then that feeling of releasing, which might look like crying, it might look like writing, it might look like moving and exercise, it might be all of the above. I do this thing. I don't know if I'm the only person that does that. Maybe people who do yoga would understand. I don't really do yoga, but I do a stretch cry. Like when I need to release emotion from my body, I either do a meditation, like Google like how to release negative emotions, and just do that, and you'll end up crying. I don't know what it is about them. They just do that. And then also moving around, but I'm talking about just very gentle stretching whilst breathing with music on. And I often end up crying with that as well if I need to process something. I don't know what's the deal with that, but it is that sense of release. So it was so wise when you said that, because I sort of intuitively do that. But then otherwise, I just wanted to recap. We've packed in a lot in this episode, from little stories to our personal experience. It's been light, it's been dark, it's been everything this episode. But I just want to recap on some of the key things we've touched on, is where we started in recognizing that you have, if you're experiencing empathy, it is a gift that you can turn into your superpower. You don't have to be scared of it. Having self-awareness, realizing when it's there to serve you and the other person. It's there to signal to you that you have a choice to make, and you can choose how you're going to show up in this moment. What does this person need? How can I serve them? The other thing we've touched on is that human suffering happens. It's like our urge to fix it and our impatience to fix it can come from our discomfort with it, and allowing yourself to allow the sadness or the difficult emotion to be there is part of this superpower. You don't have to fix it. You can hold space for it. And then the last thing is just being able to feel those feelings yourself, close the loop when you have a chance, allow whatever's happened to come through you. What you did was something beautiful that in our profession we do all the time, but it really is a very unique, very potent and profound experience to be in these spaces with people at the most vulnerable times in their lives. Like whatever is making you feel upset tonight after a day of work is probably something that you found pretty regular and routine. Is actually a really profound experience. Just acknowledging yourself for what you actually do and how you show up for that person, and really just allowing yourself to appreciate what you did today as well, and look after yourself so that you can do it again tomorrow. And you'll be like Becc says, the more you do this and the more you learn to close the loop and look after yourself and not just shove it down, you'll actually find that you'll build yourself a buffer of well-being, so that every time you're in this scenario, it'll get easier and easier and easier. Not that the emotions will get easier or the horrible things in the world will get easier, but just your understanding of your role in that scenario, what you're meant to do, your responsibilities, and what you make it mean gets easier. And you'll probably understand, or you might be doing this already, but certainly as I've shifted into more of this, like holding space for someone else, allowing the suffering to be there, I understand about myself that I could have been doing better in the past when I thought I was saving someone. That I feel like the current way that we've described here is the way that people would most benefit from most of the time. So I feel like there's so much in this episode. I really hope that it finds who it needs to find. And I just want to give a big shout out to all of my beautiful doctor humans, beautiful friends who are just doing these things in the world. Like massive, massive hug and high five. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Massive high five. And for you guys who have thought in the past, or maybe are still thinking, that your empathy is a curse and not recognizing it as a superpower, please keep this episode, re-listen to it when you need to the next time that you're struggling with this, because empathy is that, as Kristeen said, imagine your life without empathy. Imagine your work as a doctor without empathy. Imagine if your patients didn't get to experience your empathy for them. And circling back to the start of the episode, and what Kristeen's been saying throughout too, is the empathy isn't the problem. It's sort of been the firing line, but the empathy is the gift. It is an absolute gift. And some people do not have that. I think it's a skill. And I also suspect, there are some people it comes a lot more easily to and not. And again, it's very hard to quantify, but if you recognize your empathy as a gift, your ability to see another person and recognize what they're experiencing without needing to all be explained, that is a gift. And then what you choose to do with that information, what you choose to do with that understanding is where your empathy will either be, where those actions will either be aligned with your values and make you really proud, or when you feel like they might be steering you off course. But the empathy is not the bad guy here. And what we did in Dear Darling is, and we use this all the time, we talk about how our emotions, our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are related. And knowing that, we can say, well, if I know how I want to show up for the patient, if I know what I want to do, if I know how I want to respond in that moment, if I know the behavior I want to do essentially, then what emotion will make that behavior easy, will make that behavior natural? What do I need to be feeling for me to be able to show up in that way? And again, it's using these emotions on purpose. And when you don't have empathy, it's very hard to answer that question of how do I want to show up in this moment? How can I be of service of the patient? So take that empathy that you have, take that ability to connect with another person and see what they're challenged with right now, and use that to be the doctor that we know you are. Don't let anybody tell you that your emotions are categorically a bad thing. Your empathy is your superpower.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much, Becc, as always, for all the pearls of wisdom. She is a thought wizard. It never ceases to amaze me. It's so much fun. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.
I've been waiting all my life for something. I've been down the darkest roads and up in the clouds, but I've always felt that something's missing.